So where shall we start, Kunal bhai?
I see that you're very active in social media, with regards to the revival of the Indian civilization. And over a period of time, we have been talking about the need. Uh, we understand that our cosmology has a certain truth, certain validity. It is, it's been explored through methodology and means much different from what is accepted in the Western paradigm today. Primarily through spiritual means, or primarily by going beyond mind and senses. Um, and we have also spoken about the fact that this cosmology has been brutally suppressed. How did you become involved in this project of basically reviving the Indian worldview, the Indian cosmology? We can also call it the classical Indian cosmology.
Yeah, I don't know whether I'll personally use those words. Um, you asked a very personal question actually. So I'll have to tell some personal stories.
Yes.
Uh, I think as a child I was already very curious. And the questions at that time were, what am I here for? And this is like when I'm 10 years old. So I wrote a poem, I remember, which was said, this is like a 10-year-old child. When I read it back, I'm a little surprised actually. So this poem said, आए जिंदगी आ कष्ट दे तड़पा आज तेरा और मेरा मुकाबला होगा. और उसके बाद उसने बोला, दुख की नींव पर टिका है सुख का किला, गर दुख ना होता तो जान पाता कि सुख कब मिला. So very interesting that this was being written, and now I teach the Art of Living course, the happiness program of the Art of Living course, and one of the sutras we teach is opposite values are complementary.
Mm-hmm.
That the world is made up of opposites, and opposites actually give value to the other. So the experience of dukkha gives an value to the experience of sukha, and without the other, it wouldn't exist. So in some senses, किसी पिछले जन्म से लेके आया होगा कुंदन जी, ऐसे ही होगा. So the quest is, I think the quest has always been there, but the journey has been really interesting. I don't know how many people know. I did I kind of did a world exploration. I did a world exploration where in the US I was actually part of this movement called the Gurdjieff work. Gurdjieff was an Armenian mystic of the early 20th century. So for 14 years, I was very seriously as part of the Gurdjieff tradition. And in this, I learned the dances of the Sufi dervishes, because Gurdjieff had actually traveled extensively he was in Russia, Armenia, and a whole bunch of Eastern European and, Azerbaijan, sort of satellite Soviet states and that whole area. So he had gone into Christian monasteries and studied that. He had gone into, he spent time with the Sufi dervishes. There's a whole bunch of books. He wrote this book, Meetings with Remarkable Men, where he's talking about his journey. So as part of the Gurdjieff work, as I was exposed to this, and I was very seriously into it, and as I said, I spent 14 years in it. One of the things we learned in that was to get to present moment awareness. How do we actually have a moment where we are in the present, we are in this moment? After I experienced that, and I experienced that repeatedly, almost the entire Indian tradition crystallized for me. I was like, oh my God, this is what they were doing. Like in India, when I'm growing up, we talk all this philosophy. सब ज्ञान बांटते हैं सब लोग. So all these ideas, they are just ideas. They don't have like this great significance in our life. There's like, somebody saying something, this is happening. But through that experience, and that experience was very interesting because it came from a completely different tradition, but it was an experience of being in the present moment. It's an experience of waking up in a way. So when there is that little experience of waking up and the veil lifts, then it was in fact almost like a shock for me to realize that the Indian civilization was an entire civilization that had invested in this experience of the higher. The entire civilization
Yes.
was about a moment of awakening.
Right.
So every single form of the civilization, whether you look at the food, whether you look at the dance, whether you look at the music, whether you look at the architecture, whether every single aspect of it was taking us like a spiral upwards. Even the left-hand paths, so people, you talk about the Aghoris or something, and you have this whole shock. But like in the West, because I've lived there, I spent almost half my time in America and half my time in India. In the West, there are all these fringe groups also, right? Like they're the deadheads, or they are the people who are dressing in all black, or there are people who are have all kinds of weird tattoos or whatever.
Or the hippies.
Yeah, no, they
Or
might,
the hippies.
yeah, there might be
Yeah.
hippies, but there's many different kinds of. There's
Right.
not just hippies.
Yeah.
Hippie is a particular thing that's involved with maybe drug use or something, but there are other forms, other life forms in the human spectrum where they're experimenting. But what they're lacking is that in India also we have this very radical kind of difference. There can be Naga sadhus and they can be Aghoris who are eating human flesh, and there can be strict vegetarians who are not even eating onions. So like this is the whole range, right? But in that entire range, we had this, even on the Aghori, you could be an Aghori and you were still in the same quest. You were still in the same quest that was leading you towards that one moment of awareness. And then linking those moments of awareness like pearls till it becomes a steady state of awareness. And so when I came to that realization that this is what everything that we have in India is about, and there is no other culture in the planet that's like that, it was like an electric shock. It was really, really very strong. So, and there were other reasons, there were some things were happening in the Gurdjieff group that I was in that was kind of scattering. And so then I had this just a desire in my heart that I find a real guru in the Indian tradition. So at that point I said, okay, I have now explored, and I was part of esoteric Christian groups. I learned zikr from a Sufi sheikh, so I did all these different explorations, and then I was like, okay, now it's time to come back to the tradition. And so that's how I found the guru. But in fact, the Hinduism studies involvement happened even before I actually met. There's a couple of gurus I met, but I don't know. How many people have heard of this? Shall we talk about the Encarta thing? Maybe that might.
Yeah, let's talk about it.
So there was a critique of Encarta that I wrote, I think in 2001 or something. Are people aware of this at all? No, okay. So this was in the. Have people heard of this book, Invading the Sacred? No, okay. So Rajiv Malhotra. This is actually a very interesting story. I don't know how many know this whole backstory of how a little band got together with, there was this website called Sulekha, and a bunch of us actually met on Sulekha, and Rajiv Malhotra had started writing, and then I read his writing, and then I talked to him, and then I wrote this. It just happened right before I talked to Rajiv. I had read. My daughter was going to school there, and there was an encyclopedia called Encarta that Microsoft used to publish. And I just happened to read this entry on Hinduism studies in Encarta. And I was absolutely shocked when I read it, because the entire description of Hinduism, and I never really read academic Hinduism, I was never exposed to the academia or anything like that. That entire description was completely unrecognizable. I could not recognize any part of what they were saying, because I didn't grow up in a very devout family. Like we were not, there was Arya Samaj influence, and we were not into temple going or puja or anything like that. But I still had a sense of it. So, but when I read it, it was like, they were talking about Holi being played with blood, and they were talking about, I mean, this is the Encarta for children, encyclopedia for children, and they're describing Aghoris in that. Like, how do you expect children? And this is their description of what Hinduism is, right? So it was, I mean, it was just like nonsense, right? This is not, because these children would, like my children would be going to school, and other people would be reading, other children would be reading it, and this is how they would relate, to these children who are Hindu children. So I was very shocked. And then I read the other Encarta pieces on the other religions, like Christianity and Judaism and Hinduism and all of Buddhism, and I found that the only one that had such derision attached to it was Hinduism article. Everything else was actually done very, very respectfully. Islam was done very respectfully. In fact, I remember, this is on my website. You can go on sankran.org. You can go look at the Encarta article. It's got some really some. So what I did was I put together an article where I put these quotes together. I would take a quote from Hinduism, and then I would say, how is a similar subject being treated in Christianity? How is a similar subject being treated in Islam? One very interesting example was when we are talking about ahimsa in Hinduism. They are saying it's used to justify vegetarianism, but Hindus, it doesn't preclude Hindus from doing violence against untouchables or something. This is the description of ahimsa. And when I read the description of jihad, it's the exact opposite. It's like, oh, Western people, culture has negatively portrayed jihad as something violent, but it actually means inner struggle, and so what I found was that the attitude of the person who was writing the article on Islam was to correct misperceptions and to present Islam in a positive light. And the attitude of the person who was writing the Hinduism article was to make sure that the reader doesn't leave with any positive perception at the end of the article. So it was very strange. And then I later found out that this article, Encarta article, was written by a professor whose name I didn't know before then. It was Wendy Doniger, who actually had written this Encarta encyclopedia article. So after the critique was published, apparently a huge and the critique, the most difficult part, actually, they will be interested, Kundanji, in writing this critique was to manage my own emotion. A lot of times when we read something like this, we end up kind of blasting at something, or we use language which will not convince a neutral observer. And so what was really effective, it turns out that there was a big petition after that, and Microsoft was forced to change the article, and in fact they hired me as a consultant to help write the other article, and we had Arvind Sharma write it, and I kind of was the editor. I was I actually officially got employed by them finally, because I spent so many hours. They said, we have to give you a position because I spent hours and hours kind of getting the language in a way that it would be understandable to the American audience. But the interesting thing was that this whole attitude that that was there, in this Encarta article, and how do you maintain this tone where you kind of, I just put the facts together. I said, look at how this is treated, and look at how this is treated. Look at how this is treated, and look at how this is treated. And without having to so-called raise my voice in any way, that article ended up being far more convincing than if I had written a screed, which was really angry. And there's a really interesting experience that happened. So I'm starting to work with this Encarta editor. I think her name was Karen, who's, and I'm revising this Hinduism article, and Arvind Sharma has written something, and which is a very nice piece, but it's a little academic for children. So I'm kind of just making the language simpler and making some concepts simpler. I'm writing it. And at the end of the process, Karen tells me, you know what, I think I'm a Hindu. So I was like, how did this come about? It's like my dad was working in the Manhattan Project, and Oppenheimer gave him a copy of the Gita. And Oppenheimer had a very, very high regard for it. And Oppenheimer had given the copy, and she says that this was the most important book for my dad. For him, this seemed to be primary scripture. So in that sense, I'm a Hindu. So what was very fascinating in that discussion is that when we start to present what we have in a language which is accessible and understandable, it's like people, there is so much receptivity, there is so much hunger. It's literally hunger, it's more than receptivity. I mean, people are hungry for what we have. People in the West are hungry for what we have. So in a way, all of the garbage which Hinduism studies produces is in some sense also a defense mechanism. Because if we were actually able to present what we have, it would create a revolution. And that's really our job.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, I completely agree with
So
you.
sorry, long speech.
No. Great, fabulous. I'm glad that you're talking.
Yeah.
About
I
how you-
don't think I actually ever talked about this.
No, at least you and I have. We have never talked about this. So I'm glad that we got a little bit of history over there. See, the thing is that yes, there is hunger for what our civilization brings, to the United States, and we see a lot of people practicing yoga, and there are a lot of people who are seriously concerned about a serious study of our darshan. I've been teaching for a very long period of time in Western academia, and I see that on an ongoing basis. But at the same time, you find this mainstream academia adversely disposed to our tradition. And in fact, when we want to bring about changes in California's textbooks, school textbooks, the resistance that we encounter is from these academics who are teaching in mainstream universities. They are the people who get together, they write petitions, and they oppose the change. And it is basically because of their combined effort, their concerted effort, that we have not been able to bring the changes or the kind of changes that we would have ideally wanted to bring. So it's both. On one hand, you have this tremendous openness which is there within the society in terms of receiving what we have to offer, and on the other hand, you have this prejudicial resentment, if you will, against the civilization. And the thing is that, if one decides to go through mainstream education, then, and if one decides to study India and Hinduism, then this is the kind of narrative that he or she is going to encounter. And it's, and if one goes through the entire process, then it would remain very difficult for one to actually come out of it unscathed. In fact, even if you are part of that system, and if you're not completely open to what your professors are telling you, I think it is through osmosis that you will learn some of these things that are being spoken about.
Yeah, it's very true. It's very true.
I mean, this is the power of narrative.
Yeah, in fact, that's also what's happening in the Indian academia, right? I mean, what I feel is that the Ganga is merely here. The problem of Western academia, I think today it is actually stemming from Indian academia, and I'll tell you why. It's very easy to say, oh, these are white racists or something, or they're Krishna missionaries, and there is of course all of that as well. So I wouldn't discount that. But what I see the real problem is that if I look at what's being taught in social sciences in India, what we've had is ideally let us say they were embedded racism or Western concepts and so on and so forth. Ideally, we would have ambassadors from here that were going from Indian academia and setting the record straight, right? What we have is the exact reverse.
Yeah.
What we have is that even if there might be a Westerner who's open, once an Indian academic from here and trained by the Marxist schools and by the left lands there, they would in fact poison the well even more. In fact, the interesting thing is that some of the people who are at the foremost of at opposing better treatment of Hindu studies in the US Academy are Indian leftists that are in South Asian studies. And this is especially interesting because Indian leftists here claim to fight for minorities, right? But even though the Hindus are a clear, very small minority in the US, and they do face discrimination and they do face racism, but the Indian left is as opposed to Hinduism in the US Academy as it is in India. So it's obviously nothing to do with somebody's minority status, and it simply has to do with the indoctrination they receive as children of Mill, as children of James Mill in the Indian Academy. Because who has set up the Indian Academy? I mean, the entire university system is the parampara of the West, right? I mean, our universities were destroyed. Our, in fact, even the thriving colleges and other things, the institutions that existed during British times were mostly destroyed by the time of the British, right? So the entire university system, forget JNU, it was set up after independence, but all these other universities, Punjab University, or all these universities, they were set up by the West. I mean, they were set up by the British. They were set up. They are following the Guru Parampara of the original teachers who were Western teachers who were teaching them Mill, right?
So the interesting question, Sankranti, here is this: after independence, why was this discourse not sufficiently deconstructed? I think
I think we know the answer to that. That's easy.
In terms of present day education,
Yeah.
we need to critically examine this, because I personally feel, looking at the discourse which is currently active in mainstream academia, that we definitely need to create an alternative. And this alternative can only be created in a systematic, scholarly way. It cannot be done on the streets.
It cannot be done ad hoc.
It cannot be fought on the streets.
We can just do some guerrilla wars from outside, but unless guerrilla wars can only take you so far. Finally, you have to get the kingdom.
Right. Where is the discourse? Where is the narrative?
Yeah.
And the power of narrative is extremely is extremely important and strong. I'll give you an example. A couple of months ago, I went to Mexico City for a conference. Now, what is the idea that you have of Mexico City, right? It's a place where crime flourishes, and it would be very unsafe, to actually walk around the city, right?
Sure.
This is the kind of impression that you have of Mexico City. But when I went there, there are parts of Mexico City which are extremely beautiful.
Did you go to the lake where the shikaras are there?
No, I didn't go there, but I took a tour of downtown, and I also went to a portion which has recently been developed.
Yeah.
And I was surprised. I was surprised at what I saw. That was my first shock. Now, in downtown area of Mexico City, there's a cathedral, Metropolitan Cathedral. And when you go inside Metropolitan Cathedral, you will come across two altars. These are huge altars, in the sense that the first one right in front would be about 60 feet high and about 45 feet wide, and the one right behind that would be probably about 90 feet high and 60 feet wide. I'm giving you approximate measurements, and these altars are made in pure gold. The gold which you find in this cathedral was actually looted from the Aztecs. The Aztecs, as a civilization, were a very, very rich people. And I was talking to one of my colleagues who also teaches at one of the universities in the United States. And he was telling me that at the close of the last century, 20% of gold which was in circulation worldwide actually came from the loot of the Mexicans. And Mexicans they're Native Americans basically. When you think about, or when you hear about Native Americans, what do you hear? Savages, you know, people living in tribes, you know, people having a sustainable existence.
In fact,
That's basically what you hear about. But here is a civilization which was extremely rich, and I'm pretty much sure that, you know, that their civil engineering at least was very, very advanced. In fact, the city of the Aztecs was completely destroyed by the Aztecs and by the Spaniards. And what the Spaniards have done is that they have built their own cities, you know, on top of the city of the Aztecs. The Mexico downtown is basically, you know, on the city of the Aztecs. But not very far away from Mexico City is a place by the name of Teotihuacan.
Teotihuacan, yeah.
And in Teotihuacan, you know, you basically find pyramids, huge pyramids, almost as big as the pyramids that you find in Egypt. It's a World Heritage Site. And when you will take an aerial view of the place, you will find that the entire, you know, it was basically a city. It was a very well planned city. And you can definitely say that these people knew a lot about symmetry and geometry. At least.
So
and,
how,
you know, and very sophisticated in terms of aesthetics. But do we have that representation in mainstream narrative at this point in time? This civilization has been completely wiped off.
same thing with the Incas, actually. I mean,
Right.
the you know, if you go to Machu Picchu, in fact, I was in Cusco, which is the starting point for when you go to Machu Picchu. The Incas were extraordinary high level of development in all ways. And one of the more interesting thing about the Incas actually just stayed on the mountaintops, and they gave all the most fertile land to the peasants. This is a very rare thing where, you know, whoever is in control would usually take the most fertile land. And they were mostly like, they're kind of like Brahmins. They were like researchers. They were all doing research into all, you know, they were researching into different forms of corn and crops. And it was a very unique civilization which mostly was researching peace rather than war. So what happens when the Europeans land there, all they know is how to do war, right? So they basically slaughter all these people who have spent their entire generations perfecting peace. Right, and so these people who have come to save them, because they are evil and sinners. So the saved Christians come and they slaughter all of them, and it's very interesting. So they in Cusco they destroy the temple, the sacred temple, and they built a church. And you'll find this all over South America. So in fact here it's people are like. There's even the fact there's even a contest that thousands of temples were destroyed is so strange, because everywhere else in the world it's an obvious fact. There's no contest about it. I mean, if you go to Istanbul, they even have a list. These are all the places we destroyed and built mosques on. They're very proud of it, right? It's only because here you have to kind of evade the truth that there's even a debate about it. So in Cusco, they build they destroy the temple of the Incas. They built their church on top of it to show the superiority of the Christian God. They do this over and over again. Interesting thing is, an earthquake happens, and the Inca structures are so amazing because what they've done is they've chiseled granite rocks so they fit into each other. There's no mortar used. And when the earthquake comes, they actually settle even closer together. So the earthquake makes them stronger. So what happens is, they're showing the superiority of the Christian God by building the church on top. The entire church gets destroyed. The only part that gets remaining is the Incan structure. That was the base of it. Right? So this is how advanced these civilizations were, but they were all wiped out.
And you know, wiped out. And this is the power of narrative.
Yes.
That we know nothing, you know, about what existed in the past. And in fact, what we know is absolutely contrary to what existed in the past. And I think, you know, this is precisely what is happening with us also. And we are not learning, you know, from what the rest of the world is experiencing. And we need to do something about it in terms of building a discourse, you know, because as educationists, that is where our interest is. That is what we should be doing.
It is actually absolutely critical. I mean, I'm
So-
glad you
so-
brought it out. I was actually up all night. I just finished a piece in response to this whole fake Hinduism versus Hindutva narrative. I don't know if you know Shashi Tharoor and others have been pushed. There's actually a big push from the Congress also
Right.
that are positioning Hinduism versus Hindutva. And the simple summary of it is, I said, Hindutva is Hinduism that resists. So all of the people when they were wiping out the Native Americans, when they were resisting, they were called savages, right? So if you died peacefully without resisting, then you are noble. But if you
That is where the term noble savage.
yeah. So if you agree to be slaughtered, then you are a good Hindu, right? But if you resist, then you are a bad Hindutva Hindu. You have to, you have to be condemned. So that's that's why we have to go and we have to kind of pierce the veil of this narrative, and we have to do institution building.
Right.
You're very right. Yeah.
And so what we have done is that we have started this in the United States. Hindu University of America was in the process of closing down. So a bunch of us, 4 or 5 of us, who have spent at least 20, 25, 30 years understanding our own cosmology on our own terms, are involved in revitalizing the university. And I'm in the process of creating a concentration called Post-Colonial Hindu Studies. I want you people to basically explore the website, go into that concentration and see what exactly we are doing. So the larger framework is this: deconstructing the narrative which was placed on Hinduism and Hindus during the colonial period. That is the first part. The second part is reconstructing. So for reconstructing, you need to understand the cosmology, the epistemology, the methodology, which has been used, in our civilization since antiquity, which was effectively used by our ancestors. And based on that pursuit, the knowledge that was created to basically bring it into the mainstream, make it part of the mainstream discourse. So I do not know, what is happening in India at this point in time, but the aspiration definitely is that institution building should happen here. And when we talk about building institutions, we need to be very systematic about it.
So I'm actually going to jump Kundanji to questions because I think we're running out of time.
Sure.
So I'm going to consolidate a few of these, and I think you can actually elaborate your point with the context of this question. So there's 2 or 3 very similar ones by Vaibhav and Rupa. What and how can we build our narrative, and also what measures can be constituted to uplift the Indian academia, and how can those points be apprised to the present government?
I think we started, our conversation on this. So it's a very timely question. See, I can tell you about my own experience. Around 1998, I came under the influence of the teachings of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. Sri Aurobindo has written a lot on integral yoga. And as he was talking about integral yoga, he also went into our own darshanas. He begins with the Vedas, he expands on the Upanishads, he has a commentary on the Gita. And simultaneously, I also got interested in reading the teachings of Swami Vivekananda, Sri Ramakrishna, Raman Maharshi, Paramahansa Yogananda. So despite the fact that I don't have any training in Sanskrit, I only read Sanskrit for 4 years, I was able to get into our Shastras. So when I have conversation with Sanskritists, I tell them that I have not studied Sanskrit, but I have studied the Shastras. So by studying these yogis, or the records left by these yogis, I have been able to construct a certain cosmology. And at the same time, I was also saying that it is important to deconstruct or critically examine what is mainstream in Western academia. So I've done a lot of work on philosophy of science as well. So when you look at philosophy of science critically, then you begin to understand, what their mainstream or dominant narrative is, or mainstream or dominant framework is. Their dominant framework is positivism. And positivism, in very simple terms, it says that it's only that is real which can be accessed by five senses. What cannot be accessed by five senses is not even real, and it is not worth exploration. Now, that is an assumption based on which positivism works, and that is the dominant paradigm of science. Our paradigm begins when you transcend your senses and your mind. Not only your senses, but even your mind. And there are explicit ways in which you can do both. All these things are explained very clearly. So I think by going into these two traditions simultaneously, the Western tradition as well as the Indian tradition, the narrative can be built.
This is actually a really, I wanted to just add to your point there. Somebody else was asking me this as well. With the fundamental difference is that the Indian tradition at the core has Adhyatma. And this is at the core of everything. Whether we are talking about Paravidya, whether we're talking about the sciences of what's happening in the five elements, or we are talking. So Adhyatma means without knowing oneself, which is the instrument of science, right? When you talk about the five senses, you have to start asking scientific question. Who is it that is perceiving, right? So if you're a very serious scientist, to just a priori say the five senses are it is very shallow, right? Because if you look at how the Indic darshan works, it starts by keeping on unpeeling these layers of the onion, and you keep going deeper and deeper and say, who is the experiencer, who is the bhokta, what is being. So when you're going through that layer, and then from that darshan, from that seeing, it's not even a philosophy, it's seeing, it's direct seeing through the direct perception, then you can start to study. So I don't think any decolonization, I mean, you have all these post-colonial studies, subaltern studies, decolonization, falana, dimkana, right? I think they're all, at the end of it, they produce very little, because it's like you're trying to decolonize, but you're standing on this entire pillar of Western thought that you're trying to decolonize from.
Right.
How can you decolonize when your whole foundation is colonial? It's impossible. So the only way to decolonize, so the entire Indian academy is completely incapable of any decolonization, because it is based on the British parampara. So to decolonize, first we will have to find our own ground. Hum kis zameen pe khade hain? We have to find our own ground, and that ground can only be Adhyatma. So standing on that ground, then we first start to look at ourselves, and then we start to look at the structure that has been produced, and then we decolonize. And one of the other things that Bala Gangadhar said, which really struck me, is that one sort of touchstone, if we want to decolonize, he says colonialism is immoral because it robs us from accessing our own experience. So we are no longer able to access our experience. People can here write an academic treatise on caste, but it will be completely not accessing our own experience. We haven't looked at our own experience. What is my experience in my family? What is the actual thing that happened? What was my experience, right? We almost completely discard that, and then we write a big pyramid about caste.
Yeah, or what your texts are saying.
Yeah, exactly.
Or what your texts are saying. So look into your own text.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you have to. But what I'm saying is, even for us, if you take Nirvan Shatakam or the Shankar, we are saying I'm going beyond all text, right? The experience that the sages are speaking from is like they have gone beyond even all of the text, and that's why you have the bhakti poets, or you have Kabir, or you have even Guru Nanak is also saying, when they're decrying pandits, they're saying the textual, they're not talking about quote Hindu pandits, which is how the sort of the neo-Sikh version is. What they're saying is this textual knowledge is not going to help you till you get to the experience of reality for yourself, right? So what I'm saying is, yeah, the texts are super important, but I see a lot of people who are also reading texts without sadhana, without practice,
Right.
you
I
know,
agree with
and then you're
totally
still
agree with
stuck. You're still stuck at a level where you can't go further. But yeah, let me just dive into some of these other things. One question was on Rise and Fall of Hindu Women by B.R. Ambedkar. Your comments? Have you read it?
I haven't read it.
I haven't read it actually either, but
So,
it's a
as
good.
an academic, if I haven't read the book, I would not.
It's a good reference. I actually want to write on this topic quite a bit, and I have a lot of. I'm bursting with ideas on this, but it'll be another discussion. What is your view about human sacrifice in South American civilization? You want me to take this?
You can take it. I can follow with it.
Okay.
Just go ahead.
Very simple. I'll give you a 2-minute thing where you'd actually say, well, this is possible as a humane thing. And I'll tell you why. Let us say two kings were about to go to war, and there was a big revenge war that was going to happen, in which 10,000 people are going to get killed. And somebody says, I'm willing to settle, you just have to send me your one best warrior and we're going to kill him. And we save 10,000 people. Would you say this is a moral act?
Yes.
Yes. So I don't know what is the context of human sacrifice in which was happening. But all I'm saying is that just like our understanding is distorted, and I don't even know whether human sacrifice was happening or in what. So just like all the, like all the stories of women being thrown onto pyres because of sati and so on and so forth, we really have to look at all of the evidence with different eyes.
Right.
Then we understand it. But the flip side of it is, I don't think there is any God to which more human sacrifice has been done than to the Christian God. More humans have been slaughtered in the name of the Christian God on the planet than any other deity.
Also Allah.
By some orders of magnitude. No, but even with that, there's orders of magnitude, because once you read the history of what happened to the Americas, there's a book called American Holocaust that I recommend. 100 million people were killed in the Americas, over generations wiped out. 100 million. So that's human sacrifice, right? So, and what God was that too? So whenever all this discourse from the missionaries about, oh, these were terrible people doing human sacrifice, I think we need to go back and look at it.
Yeah, in fact, I would ask this question: who's telling you this story?
Yeah.
The Europeans, right? The Europeans have told a lot of stories on us. When I haven't examined the Native American civilization, but I've certainly examined, my civilization, and I certainly know that the things that they have written on us, are not true. And when I put two and two together, I would not trust, what is being said about the Native Americans. So in fact, it's like I would rather than responding to this in a positive or a negative way, I would ask this question: who told you this? Did it really happen? First we need to ascertain the veracity of this statement.
What is your source?
What is your source?
And it's that meme, by the way, is so common that you really have to question it, because they say the same story about the Nagas, and they say and when the Sati story is kind of linked to that as well in a different way, not human sacrifice. But so this is atrocity literature wherever they have to go, and they're producing it now. I mean, atrocity literature gets produced on Iraq, and then Iraq gets invaded. Atrocity literature gets produced on Libya, and then Libya gets invaded, right? And Libya is still having a civil war after Gaddafi went away. So all I'm saying is, this is a recurring meme in this civilization. It constantly goes, it demonizes, it constructs a narrative which allows the justification of the genocide that is going to follow. And the same narrative is being constructed.
In fact,
Yeah.
Ranji,
Yeah.
my idea is
Yeah.
that we will decolonize ourselves in exactly the way in which we were colonized.
Hmm.
And let me expand on that.
Okay.
You know, in 1784, William Jones comes. He puts together Asiatic Society,
Yep.
right? And then there's a proliferation of Asiatic Society in other cities. In 1817, you know, when the Marathas lose their final war with the British, History of British India is published by James Mill. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, that began a particular parampara. 1850s onwards, they start building institutions. They start building universities. And as I pointed out earlier again, you know, all these materials that they were producing here in India as well as in Europe, you know, was getting funneled into the university system. And that has created a narrative, a discourse. And we are also talking about the power of the narrative or the power of the discourse, you know, that this is what narrative or discourse does. So my idea is that until and unless we create a discourse which is in agreement with our own worldview, we won't be able to change things in academia. For that, we need to start building institutions. We need to start building scholars who can critically examine the literature which was produced on us, produce literature which can be considered alternative, and in a manner very similar to the Britishers, we need to basically funnel all these pieces of information into the education system. And I think once we are able to do that, we will be able to bring about a change. If we don't do that, you know, our bright ones, they are going to get sold to what is available in mainstream. And it's only the people who will deeply and critically examine will be able to step out from what is mainstream today and go into the alternative. And that process is not simple. You know, I know I underwent an existential crisis doing that in order to kind of get into my own worldview and understand that what was taught to me was basically not true. And I don't think a lot of people in the current times will be willing to take that challenge.
Actually, this is a question that we're going to have to address over and over again. I mean, if we're writing a new history, we almost have to start from scratch. The problem with constructing any new history is that as soon as we take this, as I said, we have this whole foundation that's been built up of Western Indology. My feeling is we actually have to throw it out of the window and start from original sources and only use original sources. And that's the only place where we can actually really start.
But Sankranji, if you are not familiar with what is there in the mainstream,
No, you have to.
even
you have to
if you
understand
throw it out, you know,
Yeah.
somebody will throw it on your face.
No, I'm not.
you will have to respond
I'm not
to that.
saying that you don't engage with it.
Right.
What I'm saying is, I mean, because people keep saying we need to write a new history, we need to write a new history, but we always end up kind of tweaking the history that's been created, you know. And there's actually a few questions about that, so I'll go with the questions. What was the source of information on prehistoric knowledge? And some part of this question is not clear. In which James Mill made this colonial history of India and the invasion theory of Aryans. What was the source of information?
This particular adage which we repeat endlessly in India, "Jiski lathi uski bhains." This is exactly what has happened. And and if you look into the writings of Michel Foucault, he also is saying the same thing, that there is a strong nexus between power and knowledge. The one who has power creates the knowledge, which is very unfortunate, and unfortunately that has not been the Indian way. The Indian way has been a dispassionate pursuit of knowledge. If you critically examine, even if you are engaging in bhakti, ultimately the end point is to gain knowledge about existence, about our existence, about the existence of the world, existence of the divine, and so on and so forth. But it's very unfortunate, particularly when it comes to producing knowledge on the people who were colonized. It was not this passionate pursuit of knowledge. The nexus of power and knowledge is extremely strong. And, jiski lathi uski bhais, that's exactly what happened.
So here again, it's around the same thing on information. It's still understandable in the US, but when it comes to India and the mainstream discourse in history, there are many things that are clearly factually wrong. For example, if you take into account graduate history syllabus and books. So I'm going to skip a bit of this. And how do you think we can come out of this, and what role can students play? I think this is a good question as a professor. How do you think we can come out of this, and what role can students play?
Come to the University of America. We'll teach you what we are doing. It is certainly going to be a collaborative engagement. There is so much that needs to be done. There will be a few people who will be the guiding light, but research has to be done. We have to be very focused on research. We have to produce evidence and materials. And for that, students need to become very original in their writings. You cannot regurgitate what is there in existence already. You have to do your own research. You have to come up with your own facts. You have to come up with your own pieces of evidence. You need to go into the original writings of this civilization, this tradition, and then you will be able to create a different narrative. But my experience suggests that in order to bring about this change in narrative, evidence is not going to be sufficient. You have to make this discourse politically incorrect. It is extremely important. The colonial framework in which this discourse has been created has to be made extremely explicit. And I have only given few examples today. Anything which is there in mainstream on India and Hinduism, I'm telling you, you will be able to find evidence for its genesis in the tradition which was created by James Bell.
So we have a couple of questions. Maybe I can take one or two here. It's saying, why don't we see you and your work in mainstream media, and why are our youth not connected with its root and religion, Hinduism? Well, I think the mainstream media problem, in a way, again, stems from that same stack. Where are these people getting educated? Who's educated them? Right? So you can't expect people who are graduating from these universities to come out with anything but contempt, because the whole system is teaching contempt, right? So, and especially when you're going into humanities and social sciences, in some senses, I consider myself lucky, because of course, there's also a missing part of the education, but coming from a science stream and then not being educated formally in the social sciences, in a way, has also been helpful, because I don't have to de-indoctrinate myself. I can just look at it from fresh eyes. Of course, there's mainstream media indoctrination. So I think the mainstream media problem comes from academia. So it's the academia problem. As far as the youth are not connected, I think you should answer the question. What are you doing at home? Why are your children not connected? Why are our children not connected? So I think what happens at the home is actually super, super important for this. I mean, if all we are telling our children is, beta, learn Baba Black Sheep, and make sure that we only speak in English to children at home, and this whole thing, I mean, what are we teaching? That question has to be really, and also it has to be taught in a way where it is relevant. I mean, for small children, it doesn't matter. For small children, just doing the puja, doing a practice, because they'll emulate, they'll just follow it. They will, but for older children, it's really important to have somehow for them to feel relevance. I've raised two children in the U.S. and there was very interesting stories with both my children, and I was very much into art of living, and my ex-wife was also kind of in this, and the children were kind of actually rebelling against it for a while. And now my daughter is in San Francisco, and she's going to satsang every week, and with the Hare Krishnas, and she's learned the Sahaj meditation for the art of living, and she's like saying, everybody in the city is following what you were saying, Papa. So in San Francisco, this is mainstream in a way, it's like the whole new age movement, all of these things. So and she herself came to it through just without indoctrination, without any of this, just having the conversation and presenting the options and talking about how it is relevant. And it's relevant. I mean, this is what really is the genius of our tradition and why it's so relevant for humanity. We are addressing the central questions of human existence. How can I be happy? How can I have this happiness stay for a long time and not for a short time? What is real? Right? These are the core questions. So there is no religion in India. There is nothing like religion. In fact, what we have is very deep systems of inquiry.
Yeah. Particularly when it came to matters dharmic.
In all matters.
In fact, observing the society in which Swami Vivekananda was born, he says that the Indian social system is very regimented, but the Indian religion, of course he used religion for dharma, during his times, is extremely free. And he said that you find exactly the opposite in the Western societies. The social system is very, very free, but their religion is extremely regimented. And I think, that holds true even today. So, I just wanted to add one thing to what you're saying. In the past, I've done my research. I've written books, but I have not put them out on the social media. It's very interesting, how that habit continues even now. I gave an entire presentation, based on the work that I did on California textbooks. I've also written this book, called Making Children Hinduphobic, and I did not speak about this book even once. So I just wanted to talk about it. If you're interested in reading it, there are few copies available. I brought some copies. You can take them with you, and it's available on Amazon. Tell others to go through this. Many of the things which are discussed here in this book, I'm sure, will be relevant in India as well.
It's very useful. I have read the book. It's very, very just a nice summary but still shows the depth of the knowledge and the research. So I highly recommend this. And let's see, I have a couple more questions. One other thing, just to finish off that youth question, and I might sound like a broken record here, but it's really important for us to ask how we are connected with our tradition. Like everybody in the room, we have to ask, we have to ask, because I see, and I kind of put this out to many Hindu groups that I talk to. What is your connection with the tradition? What are you doing? Do you have a practice? Do you do puja? Do you do dhyana? What is it in your life that where is it situated in your life? Because unless it is living in us, we can't hope to pass it to our children. But sometimes it's true. I mean, sometimes the children will come back and teach us because we've lost it so much, and now they've found it because they went on their own journey. So that's happened. But we really have to ask this question, and I'm kind of throwing it out as a challenge. And then I'm have a couple of this here. One is context of controversy and subsidized education. Do you think reducing state funding of Marxist education would be helping in the narrative? Or do you want to take it? I think it's not.
I'm not very much familiar with the Indian context,
Yeah.
so I would.
This other one is presenting positive projection is one thing, but the need is to counter misinformation or negativity. We have concept of Suryast at end of the day in battle, where in all other cultures everything was fair in love and war. How can we do this ethical concept?
Creating that narrative. I'm going back to it over and over again. And you can only create a narrative by citing evidence. So what I'm saying is, go into the Dharma Shastras, go into other texts which were talking about the social morass of the ancient times, and bring out pieces of evidence that talk about this, and compare it with what transpired in history when civilizations other than the Indian civilization were involved. Like, my hypothesis is it's not yet a theory. We have lost some decisive battles, because of our commitment to dharma. The first one that comes to my mind is the battle that Porus lost, with Alexander. This very thing, that we did not make war after sunset, was something that we were observing. But Porus was attacked by Alexander at night.
So I've been asked to wind it up.
Yeah. So let me finish this,
Okay.
and then we'll wind it up. The second one is the war that took place between Prithviraj Chauhan and Muhammad
Yes.
Ghori. I mean, the folklore is that he was forgiven 16 times, and that was because he would fall in the feet of Prithviraj Chauhan. Where does this come from? This is mentioned in your Dharma Shastras, that if your enemy seeks for forgiveness by falling on your feet, you would not take his life. I was watching this movie, Kesari, and this individual, I don't remember his name, he was saying that, that we need to give water to our enemies. We were following the Dharma, but when you follow Dharma in a war which is essentially adharmic, then in my understanding, you need to transcend the binary divide between adharma and dharma and get into the space, where winning actually becomes important. So with that, I will close.
I'll actually just flip that very quickly. I think our failure is, and this is the failure of all native cultures, is failure to understand the nature of Christo-Islam. We actually never understood what we are dealing with.
Yeah.
And this is true for all of the native cultures. Now, in fact, if you look at how the Aztecs got conquered, it was completely the same story. They were following dharma, and the other side had no clue, interest in it whatsoever. They were only interested in gold. One side was following dharma, the other side was following gold.